Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Richard Naylor from the Friends of the Pine Bush community, and we are once again honored to co-sponsor with Commission staff today's monthly science lecture in webinar format, 50 Years of Memories, the Sand Plains of Glacial Lake Albany. So as questions occur to you during the presentations, we suggest that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you don't see it, you might have to just move your cursor down to the bottom and then it'll pop up, and just look for the Q&A and type away. Jackie and Al will see those questions and be able to answer them when they want to, often at the end of the program. So that's a cool way to do it. Before today's commission host, lead educator Jackie Citroniti, introduces our speaker today, let me tell you about next month's science lecture webinar. So we're very happy it's on. And the way things are going, we're taking it 1 month at a time. I can't tell you what's in 2 months, but next month, it's going to be on the 17th of September, again, the third Thursday. And the topic will be Earthworms of the Northeast, Invasive Threats and Conservation Opportunities. Dr. Tim McKay, professor in the biology department and environmental studies program at Colgate University, will describe recent and ongoing work to better understand the ecology of earthworms in the Northeastern United States. The earthworm community of the Northeast consists of native species, European species that invaded a long time ago, which kind of makes them immigrants, I guess, by now, not just aliens, and Asian species that colonized more recently. So invasive species are fighting for habitat in a changing landscape, and that creates conservation challenges. However, new insights into native earthworms of the region have created conservation opportunities as well. That should be good, and hope you can make it. And now, back to today, and I'll turn it over and blank my screen out to Jackie.
Thanks, Richard. For those of you who don't know me, as Richard said, I'm Jackie Citroniti. I'm lead educator at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. I am honored that not only Dylan asked me, but that I get to introduce Al Breisch. I've learned so much from him over the years, as well as amazing mentor, the work he's done. And I'll just quick give you a little background. Al Breisch came to New York in 1964 to rock climb and hike in the Adirondacks. This led Al to pursue a graduate degree at SUNY Albany and his introduction to the Albany Pine Bush at a time when Western Avenue of the Northway was sparsely developed. Washington Ave Extension did not even exist, and Route 155 was a narrow, winding road between Western and Central Avenue. Bryce will recount some of his involvement with the people who promoted protection of the pine bush and some of the interesting amphibians and reptiles that make the pine bush their home. As the amphibian and reptile specialist for New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, he initiated and directed the Amphibian and Reptile Atlas of New York. He is co-author of the Amphibians and Reptiles of New York State and Habitat Management Guidelines for Amphibians and Reptiles of the Northeast United States. His latest book, The Snake and the Salamander, Amphibians and Reptiles from Maine to Virginia, received the 2018 National Outdoor Book Award in the Nature and Environmental category. Bryce retired in 2009, but remains active in a variety of studies involving both herpetofauna and vegetation. In his spare time, he serves as chairman of the Helderberg Workshop, an adventure in learning, and enjoying his 4 grandkids. And without any further ado, I introduce Al Breisch. Thank you so much tonight, Al.
Well, thank you, Jackie. I did my 5 years of undergraduate work as a botany major at Penn State from 1962 to 1967. So how did I end up at SUNY Albany, and how did I become the herp guy if I really was a botanist? Well, when I got to Penn State my freshman year, even before going to any classes, I immediately joined the outing club. A woman named Trudy Healy was one of our advisors to the rock climbers. And I started coming to the Adirondacks with Trudy in 1964 to help her write descriptions for some of the rock climbs for the climbing guide that she was working on. Back then, it was a long trip from Penn State to Keene. Interstate 80 across Pennsylvania didn't exist. And at that time, the Northway stopped at Saratoga. The weekend trips to rock climb in the Adirondacks often turned out to be a 4 or 5 day long weekend. And maybe that helps explain why my undergraduate degree took 5 years. My first job in New York was in 1965 as a hut boy at Johns Brook Lodge, which is owned by the Adirondack Mountain Club. That summer, I got to meet some of the interesting people of the Adirondacks, like naturalist botanist Ed Ketledge from ESF, Jim Goodwin, one of the driving forces for the Adirondack Mountain Club. And later in the summer, I learned about a guy named Vince Schaefer, who for years worked for General Electric, but he started an interesting program for undergraduate students at Whiteface Mountain, which intrigued me. I thought I should find out a little bit more about that. So I applied and was accepted and spent the summer of 1966 at Whiteface Mountain. I'm sure some of you older people might remember Ray Faulkner, who was a meteorologist on our local radio station here in the Capital District. He was the director at Whiteface. And that's me. That's what I looked like back in 1966. So working in Whiteface for the summer, again, I met some very intriguing people. And one of them was a gentleman named Paul C. Lemon, who was a biology professor at SUNY Albany. Another was John Scott, also at Albany, but he was in the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences program. After working with those two gentlemen for the summer, I decided if I'm going to school in New York, I should go to SUNY Albany, and that way I could be near the Adirondacks. Which, when I got to Albany, John Scott offered me a research assistantship, so I got to spend 2 more years on Whiteface Mountain all summer long, and a lot of weekends. In the fall, I started my fall of 1967, I started my master's degree program with Dr. Lemon being my major professor. Here he is feeding an eland, which was his favorite antelope. He had spent a year in Africa, and he was just fascinated by them. And one of the field trips we did when I took his ecology class was to go to the Catskill Game Farm and see all the different ungulates that was there. They had a tremendous collection. At that time, he was married to Dr. Stewart, who was a herpetologist. And I took her class, the biology of the vertebrates. You see her here, she's doing work, some work in Allegheny State Park, and that's her first graduate student, Tom Wathaw. Picture looks a little bit like they're toasting wine, but actually what she's doing is she's holding the tail of a mouse. They were making study skins from the animals they trapped. The other highlight of my first semester in Dr. Lemon's class was I met my future wife, Sharon. Both classes, both the vertebrate class and Paul Lemon's ecology class, did a lot of trips to the Pine Bush. It was convenient to the university, and it was an easy place to go. When I first went, I thought, this area looks a lot like the Pitch Pine Scrub Oak Hills around the Penn State campus. And it took me a while to really start understanding the differences there. The main difference, of course, is the pitch pine around Penn State is on ridge tops, and the communities with thin soil on bedrock, whereas the pine bush, of course, is very deep sand. When I got there, the area we now call the pine bush was very much different. You'll see in this map, Washington Avenue Extension wasn't there at all. Rapp Road was a little small road that wandered from Western Avenue to Central Avenue, but it was mostly through undeveloped pine barren. Route 155 was even less of a road. It wasn't close to the high-speed direct route that it is today. You can see where Old State Road came into a dotted line that represented 155, and the Discovery Center would be approximately where that red dot is. Imagine how great that area would look like with the less development that we have today. One of the things I distinctly remember about going out in the field with Dr. Lemon on the class, when we went to the pine bush, the first thing he would do is go to the houses hidden off the beaten path, a little enclave right off of Rapp Road. And he would actually ask permission from the African-American families there if it would be all right for him to take his class and explore the pine bush. It was an experience, I think, from his days in Africa. He just loved those people, he loved the habitats, and he really appreciated that they would allow us. Dr. Lemon did his graduate work in Nebraska, and he had published a number of papers on fire management. He often discussed natural fires and man-made fires, and he was always thrilled when the pine bush caught on fire. And back in those days, from our office in the biology building on campus, and even better, from the high floors in the dorm rooms, we'd often see multiple columns of smoke from the fires started by someone out in the pine bush. And often when we saw them, the graduate students would walk around saying, "Where is Dr. Lemon? Did he have anything to do with that?" We never really found out if he did or not. Back then, not many people were working in the pine bush. My office mate, Steve Cooper, was one of them. He did his master's on the soil vegetation relationships of the pine bush, and he, of course, was also one of Dr. Lemon's students. After I completed my degree, I was offered a 2-year job by a guy named Richard Nixon to go in the Army. But when I got through with my 2 years, I came back into the Albany area and did a number of short-term jobs working for the university at the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. And then I spent 10 weeks with Meg Stewart and her husband George studying tropical frogs in the mountains of Jamaica, which was a wonderful experience, one of the key experiences in my career. And I really think it set the professional path that I eventually took towards studying amphibians and reptiles. Since I was on the GI Bill at that time, I could also sign up for some classes I didn't have time to take when I was a grad student. And one of those courses was called The History of Natural History by Dan Mckinley. And it was one of the most enjoyable classes that I had ever taken. Dan introduced me to a naturalist named James Yates, who is a well-known naturalist from right here in the Albany area. And he was also the first naturalist to set foot on the continent of Antarctica in the mid-1800s. Yates also had some very interesting observations of herps in the pine bush, including this early 1800 tiger salamander that he got his hands on. I'll talk more about Yates a little bit later. About the same time, I met this gentleman, Frank Levitt, who was the director of the Soil and Water Conservation District in Albany County. He was also on the board of the Eastern New York chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and he introduced me to quite a few of the leaders of the chapter at that time. Frank was an early advocate for protecting the pine bush, and he lamented to me that if TNC had listened to him, they could have bought the entire pine bush for about $300 an acre. But that was long before Washington Avenue Extension was built, before 155 was straightened, and before the Carner Blue butterfly was listed by the state of New York in 1977. It was those things that really put the focus on the pine bush and got preservation moving. In a conversation one day with Frank while we were in the field, I mentioned that I had found a colony of a small shrub along Route 155 in the pine bush that I had never seen before. Rose acacia, Robinia hispida. This is a cousin of the black locust, which is an invasive tree species that the Pine Bush Commission is working hard on to eliminate. Somewhat sheepishly, Frank admitted that he had planted it in an effort to stabilize a sloping bank shortly after the road was widened and straightened, since the contractor had done put in very little effort to do anything to control erosion. I've checked on it for years now, and it doesn't seem to be spreading. It does, in part, get mowed by the road crew every year, but Frank did regret that he planted it there. This is a photo I got from Meg Stewart showing 155 shortly after it was improved, as I'm sure they call it, from about 1972. You can see where Old State Road comes out to it, and this would be where the Discovery Center is today. Very open, and hopefully the management that is going to be done will bring it back. One other thing that my friendship with Frank did for me, and knowing a number of people in the Eastern New York chapter, but helped me in actually landing, I guess what I'd call the first permanent job I ever had outside of the Army. And that was working for the Albany County Environmental Management Council, starting in 1978 as a biologist, and then later on as an environmental analyst. Our team at the Environmental Management Council evaluated and made recommendations on many of the larger developments that had been proposed for the county. One of these projects that drew a lot of public interest and opposition was a proposal to build a large shopping mall off of Western Avenue, just west of the Northway. And I'm pretty sure you all know what shopping mall that might have been. When I first visited the Crossgate site, this is what I saw. And I was kind of transported to the Eastern Prairie, thinking that when I go up over this ridge and look down the other side, I could very well see a herd of bison running through the property, grazing on the blue lupin and big blue stem grass that grew commonly on the side. When I checked aerial photos at the time, I could see that this patch of prairie had remained pretty much the same condition, at least back into the 1940s. It wasn't, the surrounding trees and shrubs were not growing into it. It was being maintained apparently pretty much on its own as an open grassland. It was our good fortune at the time that my old professor, Margaret Stewart, had recruited a undergrad, John Rossi, 2 years earlier, to do a study of the herpetofauna of the pine bush. And furthermore, one of his study sites just happened to be where the proposed mall was going to be placed. The most significant herp that Rossi found on the Crossgate site was eastern worm snake, pictured in the upper right-hand corner here. But because it had no legal status at the time, it was given little consideration during the permit process. DEC held an adjudicatory hearing concerning the Crossgate application that lasted for 81 days and produced 17,000 pages of transcript. Pyramid officials argued that the mall would boost the local economy and increase the employment without damage to existing businesses. And at the same time, they argued that the project would not harm the environment in the nearby Pine Bush, as if where they were plopping down this big mall was not actually Pine Bush. As an employee of the Environmental Management Council, I was asked by my boss to attend the hearings and participate in any way that I could. I'm not sure he understood what that meant, because I went along with my coworker, Mark Fitzsimmons, and we attended about 20 of the sessions, of the 81 sessions, virtually all the ones that dealt with vegetation, wildlife, natural resources. And we also provided a full day of testimony on the wildlife and vegetation of the site and the possible impacts the mall would have. In addition, I signed up as a person who would be allowed to cross-examine a number of the witnesses that represented the developer and witnesses that represented the opposition. One of those witnesses that I got to question was Meg Stewart, who talked about the wildlife on the site and in particular how unique the eastern worm snake was to the capital region and the Pine Bush in particular. Another witness was Peter Nye from DEC's Endangered Species Unit, who presented testimony on the Carner blue butterfly, which by then was a state endangered species. The opposition provided detailed expert testimony concerning the serious and unavoidable damage construction of the mall would cause. But in the end, as you know, the mall got the permit and it was constructed. Little did I know at the time that within a year, Pete Nye would be my boss when I left the county to work as a biologist at DEC. When I look at aerial photos like this, showing huge blocks of development in areas where undeveloped wildlands existed only 50 years ago, before the Washington Avenue extension was built and Route 155 was improved, I am saddened to think of all the lost opportunities. There's Crossgates occupying that entire corner. It used to be such a beautiful little eastern prairie. As for Meg Stewart, she vowed that if built, she would never step into the mall. A promise I believe she kept. She kept her love for the Pine Bush and marveled at what the commission had accomplished and how fire was being used to restore the plant communities. A couple of years before her death, she was having difficulty walking. So after one particular large burn, I decided to go to the Pine Bush and get some pictures of that burn to show her. I got to the trailhead and I started in, and who should I encounter walking through the recently burned area but Meg Stewart, with her cane, slowly walking back towards the trailhead. She greeted me with a huge smile, and she said, "Isn't this marvelous? Now, give me your arm and help me get back to my car." Okay, I'd like to divulge or diverge slightly and talk about amphibian and reptile diversity in New York State as a whole, and then come back to how the pine bush fits in. As Jackie mentioned, I had designed and directed the New York State Herp Atlas when I was part of the Endangered Species unit because I saw a need to better understand all the species in the state, not just the few species designated as endangered or threatened. Little was known about the distribution of most of the species, and we knew virtually nothing about their status. So how could we evaluate these species if we wanted to amend the list of endangered threatened species if we didn't know what their status was? For 10 years, we collected data from a large cadre of citizen scientists. And now, even 20 years later, 20 years after the official end date, 1999, I continue to receive reports of observations from around the state. The database now is somewhat over 100,000 animals, and really thinking about it's time to actually start a new series, just as the Breeding Bird Atlas has, and redo the whole state again. This map shows the cumulative species diversity of all our atlas blocks from around the state. And you see that red dot in Albany County, that's the Voorheesville Quadrangle. It has 33 species. The Voorheesville Quad includes some pine bush and some Helderberg escarpment. So you're getting a variety of habitats there. The blue quad to the right of the red dot is the Albany Quadrangle, which includes much of the Albany Pine Bush, but has none of the Helderberg escarpment. And it has 29 species. Albany County is one of the more diverse counties in the state in terms of amphibians and reptiles, having 47 out of the 72 species. And Albany Pine Bush itself is one of the more diverse areas, having pretty high diversity of all things in Albany County except salamanders. Salamanders aren't as abundant, as diverse in a sandy situation as they are in the hill towns, the limestone areas and whatnot. That's where you get the higher diversity. Now, James Yates, as you saw in that earlier picture, had reported tiger salamanders from Albany County. And he talks about this specimen being brought to him just a few miles from the city. And this was the second one that he had received. The other one he thought had been brought to the city in a hollow piece of wood down the Erie Canal. That doesn't make any sense to me because there are no tiger salamanders to the west of us. So I don't know how a hollow piece of wood could have possibly picked up a tiger salamander. I think both of these animals would have had to have come from the Albany Pine Bush. Albany's kind of an extreme outlier for this species. The sandy soil is ideal habitat, but the next closest area with a lot of big sandy soil is Long Island, and that's where you really find most of the tiger salamanders that still remain in the state. So, as far as I'm aware, those were the only tiger salamanders ever found in Albany until 1994. During a field trip that I was leading for the New York Natural History Conference to see what amphibians we could find in the pine bush. Since there's a slim chance of actually finding an ambystomid salamander on a trip like that, I had placed a few minnow traps the day before in hopes of catching a blue spotted or a spotted salamander. At the third pond we visited, with a group of 25 conference attendees looking on, I pulled up a trap and found this. Boy, I have some really funny friends. This wooden tiger salamander now sits at home in my bookshelf. And indeed, the only remaining tiger salamanders in the state are down on Long Island. The eastern box turtle is another species that apparently was common in the Albany Pine Bush, according to James Yates, again in 1835. It's my belief that there is still a lot of habitat where box turtles could survive in the pine bush, but we don't see them. The heart of the box turtles range is Long Island and the lower Hudson River from southern Greene County and Columbia County south, but they still occur in Saratoga County, a few occasionally reported here and there. We can't always believe those records because this box turtle was highly prized as a pet years ago, even though it's been illegal to possess them in New York since 1905. But some of these random points around the state and even around the Capital District where box turtles have been reported, they could be either released or escaped pets. The surveys we've done in the pine bush, we have not been able to find one since the 1970s. Another species that Yates thought was common, seen everywhere in pools of clear water about the Pine Plains, were the spotted turtles. That's no longer true. The shallow vernal pools that once were much more common in the pine bush and would have provided habitat for both this species and the tiger salamanders have for the most part disappeared. When an old friend of mine, Bill Town, who was a naturalist who studied sphagnum moss in particular, was surveying for sphagnum moss in the pine bush, he stumbled on a spotted turtle in the early 1970s. Everyone got excited, at least all the herp people got excited, but we could not find another one. Then in 1966, as I was leading a group into the pine bush, I went to that same wetland. We were there to listen for spring peepers and talk about them. My daughter was with me, Kirsten, and she waded on ahead of everybody else, and she yells, "Dad, I see a spotted." I responded, "A spotted salamander," since I had seen spotted salamanders and Jefferson salamanders in this pond earlier. And she said, "No, a spotted turtle." That was a fantastic find. And after that trip, we began trapping and surveying that wetland much more intensively. We determined that it actually had a fairly nice sized little population, including young, showing good signs of reproduction, and juveniles. So, great place. Two of Meg Stewart's students did herp surveys at multiple sites throughout the pine bush. John Rossi, who I had mentioned earlier, who found the worm snake on the Crossgate site, actually did 29 sites in 1975 to 1977. And about 20 years later, Kim Corwin, who at that time was working for me, did a similar survey in 1996 to 1998. To the extent possible, Kim tried to survey the sites that John Rossi had surveyed, but she found that 8 of those sites had been lost to development, like Crossgates Mall. But both sampled the various habitats, the ponds, the streams, the wetlands, the upland habitat sites. Rossi, in his survey, had found 29 species, of which 3 of them, the box turtle, wood turtle, and black racer, native species that Kim did not find. And he also found the introduced red-eared slider. Kim found 26 species, and she found 2 that John Rossi did not find, the stink pot and the green snake. But neither one of them found 3 species that had been previously recorded, and we didn't really expect to find them: the eastern tiger salamander, the eastern rat snake, and the timber rattlesnake. My daughter Kirsten, again, the one who had found spotted turtles, when she started working in the Pine Bush when she was a student at Cobleskill, helping to propagate native plants to restore the natural communities. After working on that for a year, she migrated into helping with the Carner Blue butterfly surveys, and at the time was pursuing a master's degree on refining the survey techniques for the Carner Blue. She's the kind of person who has good eyes, and she's never really not thinking about herps. I like to think it's hereditary. But she found a green snake and called me up, and we immediately thought, well, I've got to go see it, and we've got to look a little bit harder. For the previous 30 years, I had been looking for green snakes, and although I found them in other sites, I had never found one in Albany County. So once again, my daughter tops me. So what we did was we began a cover board survey. That is, put out wooden boards with the idea that the animals would use them as boards to hide under. And by checking the boards every once in a while, we might find more snakes. And you can see in my hand right there, there's 3 of them that were under one board. It was lift the board and do a quick grab. Well, the boards were more successful than we thought. They not only used them as a place to seek shelter, but they also deposited their eggs under the boards. And we found 3 green snake nests under the boards with a total of 25 eggs. And they hatch very quickly. So we had these cute little less than pencil thin snakes coming out of those eggs. They're dark when they first come out. They turn more of an olive drab, and eventually they turn that bright green that we see later. Kirsten, still working on her butterflies, discovered a site with Spadefoot toads on one of the restoration sites. When she first found them, said, well, again, I've got to go out and see what you found. It was following a torrential rain when you'd expect to see them in their breeding ponds. So Kirsten and I, plus 2 friends, went out that night to check, and we heard Spadefoots calling from a slightly different area where she had found them. When we checked that out, we watched it for hours, from about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night until almost midnight. And the whole time we're watching it, more and more Spadefoots are coming into that pond and calling. And we set up grids and did counts, and by about midnight, we had an estimate of nearly 500 adult Spadefoot toads. In my previous 25 years of searching for Spadefoots, I had never heard more than 12 calling in any one night. by 2006, which was when we found this site, Meg Stewart could no longer get out at nighttime surveys. So we recorded the chorus using Kirsten's cell phone and played it back to her the next day. She had a hard time believing that a chorus with that many spadefoots could possibly come from the pine bush, because it's something she had not seen in her 50 years of being in the pine bush area. Kirsten went on to find several more that year, and then Amanda Dillon, I think starting the following year, focused on spadefoots in some of those areas and continued to find more spadefoots. So we've got a much better understanding of where the spadefoots are now than we did 40 years ago when I thought they're on their way out and they're going to disappear. If you look at this map, you'll notice that there's several of these very disjunct populations. That one with the green arrow there up in the Wilton Wildlife Preserve and Park. There's the population here in the Albany Pine Bush. And then there's a newly discovered population down in Dutchess County on, ironically, well, after it was discovered, TNC decided to buy the property, so now that's a protected preserve also. But those are the only three areas outside of Long Island, which is kind of the stronghold for spadefoot toads. A very odd distribution, wondering how they hopscotched up to these isolated areas. But Long Island is certainly the stronghold. After that worm snake was buried under the Crossgates parking lot in 1982, it was not reported from the pine bush again until 1986, when it was found on the power line right away that runs near the Crossgates site. But because it was on that power line right away, it was spared from the developer's bulldozer. But then after 1986, it was another 22 years before the next one was found. And this was in the same general area that, you know, that power line runs right almost adjacent to the Washington Avenue extension. Well, let's do it. Individuals in 2008 were found on a site that was going to be developed into a hotel. And again, because worm snakes have no political clout, the hotel was built. So from my perspective, the score right now is developments 2, worm snakes 0. And there's the development site. The worm snakes were found under the debris scattered on the site, and then they're gone. Although I haven't really myself done studies on the spadefoot toad, it's a species that we do encounter while we're doing these other surveys, and it's a really neat individual. A neat species. Whenever we encounter them, you almost feel like you've got to do something. But a lot of people look at that and they see the shape of the head, they see the pattern, and they think it's a venomous snake. It's not. It has that stout body, it has that prominent pattern, but it is a very harmless snake, at least to humans. They are known to put up a lot of bluster when they feel threatened. They will shake their tail, and if it touches dry grass or leaves, it can sound just like the rattle of a rattlesnake shaking its tail. And if that doesn't make you back up a little bit, they flatten the skin on their neck, making it look hooded like a cobra. that may fail also. And if that does, then they just roll over in their back and play dead. If handled, they really virtually refuse to bite you unless you've been handling their favorite food, which is a toad. And if they sense that there's the smell of toad on your hand, they may mistake that for their favorite food and bite you. But that would be a rare event. You may recall in that title slide, I had a picture of two Blandings turtles. They were not from the pine bush, they're from Wilton. The population up in Wilton was discovered by Kathy O'Brien when she was doing a Carner Blue butterfly survey. It's hard to believe a turtle that size and that terrestrial went undiscovered for so long, especially in the Wilton area of Saratoga where there's just so much development. This population represents a very disjunct population from the closest one in Dutchess County or the ones up along the St. Lawrence River. These other dots are just single turtles observed. We haven't been able to identify a population in any of those other sites. So again, it's one of those mysteries of how did they get there and what do they mean? And the genetics work that has been done on them has probably done more to confuse that question than to really answer it. Another one of the people that worked with us, Andreas Chalu, completed her master's thesis on the Wilton population in 2011. But that would be another whole story to tell, so we won't really talk about it here. Andrea Chalu also did another coverboard study, kind of as a follow-up to Kirsten's coverboard study with the green snakes. She added 3 sites, and she was testing the effectiveness of making coverboards either of metal or of wood. And she had 20 of each set out at each of these 3 sites. When all of it was said and done, the wooden coverboards were by far the most successful. And actually, looking under debris that she found while working in the area, she found more herps than she did under her metal coverboards. And she also got some from just casual observations, species on the surface as she was going from one to another. And if you look at her 3 sites, she did one along the Hunger Kill, one along Willow Street, and one in the landfill area. You see that the Hunger Kill has the highest diversity of species, whereas the landfill site has the highest number. And we see that 2 of the most common species anywhere, the redback salamander and the garter snake, were the 2 species, the only 2 species found in all 3 sites. And although I'm not reporting on the specifics here, please note that Lisa Pepino, also a student at Albany, not one of Meg's, it was after Meg was gone, completed her master's thesis on the herp communities of Pine Bush in 2012 to 14. When Meg Stewart came to Albany, there was very little known about the herpetofauna of the glacial Lake Albany area, except for scattered notes from people like James Yates and a few museum records. We now, after her 50 years and another 10 since she died, we have a much more complete record of what species there are and where they can be found in the pine bush. And much of this data was compiled by Meg Stewart's students and serves, in my mind, as an excellent baseline set of data for future management actions. Before I try to sum this all up, I'd like to take a note on, I'm just checking the time, how much time we have. note on the Fowler's toad, another one that's just in the Pine Bush area. It's somewhat similar to the American toad, except the Fowler toad has more warts per black dot, usually 2 or more warts per black dot, as opposed to the American toad that has 1 or 2 warts per black dot. The American toad is distributed throughout New York. The Fowler's toad is pretty much restricted to Long Island, the lower Hudson, getting up into Wilton area, and the very southern tip of Warren County, and way out here on Lake Erie in the west. We believe they came across from the province of Ontario, which has a healthy population of Fowler's toads. Somehow they made it across the lake. When I go out and look for toads in the pine bush, the feeling I get, although I don't have numbers because I didn't take as good a data as I should, but Fowler's toads are not nearly as common now, either in Wilton or in the pine bush, as they were 40 years ago. So what makes the pine bush so special in terms of amphibians and reptiles? Well, here's the species that have been recorded in the pine bush and not found anywhere else really in Albany County. Unfortunately, the eastern tiger salamander is gone. The box turtle is probably gone. The Fowler's toad, the worm snake, and the hognose are probably precarious at best. We don't have good population estimates for any of those. And the Spadefoot toad, although we find lots of them following a really torrential rain, they're explosive breeders. They only call for 1 or 2 nights, produce their young, and go hide in the sand again. Probably have a better chance of surviving than the others do. But it could also be that it took us a long time to figure out how and where to find the Spadefoots. And maybe we need to think the same thing for the Fowler's toads, the box turtles, and the hognose snakes, that they may actually have a better chance. What have we lost? We lost the tiger salamander in 1835. We lost the timber rattlesnake in 1852. It probably not surprising to most people. The timber rattlesnake is a upland hardwood species, or at least that's how we think of it. But timber rattlesnakes did occur on Long Island into the early 1900s, and there's still a healthy population. Well, by healthy, it's still endangered in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. So they do survive and do quite well, or they're capable of it in those kind of habitats where they don't have the rock crevices to go into. But the timber rattlesnake has also been persecuted since the day that European settlers arrived on this continent. So it's been a hard life for them. The rat snake, the racer, and the box turtle, they haven't been seen in quite a while. There's still a chance. We don't really know. The rat snake I have in southern Albany County, which is a good distance from here. But just last week, I received a report of eastern rat snakes at the Five Rivers Environmental Education Center. So we don't know what that means. We've only seen one. There's been tens of thousands of people walking the trails at Five Rivers over the years. So what does that snake mean? Maybe there is a small population closer to the pine bush than we know, but we just don't know. The black racers are not common, but they're more frequently seen up in the Wilton Wildlife Preserve and Park area. The box turtle is also up in Saratoga County. So there are possibilities here, but we don't really know. What has caused these declines? Two main things: roads, which fragment the habitat and cause direct mortality from animals trying to cross roads, and development, residential housing, shopping malls, landfill expansion. These things are all contributing to the decline of the amphibians and reptiles. On the other hand, on a positive note, the efforts of the Pine Bush Commission to protect the large swaths of habitat and maintain these habitats as a mosaic of typical pitch pine scrub oak community habitats, open grasslands with lupin and numerous nectar sources, stream corridors, vernal pools. They will continue to provide suitable habitat for our native amphibians and reptiles. So I'd just like to acknowledge some of the key people that have helped me over the years. When Dylan first asked me to do this, I kind of outlined my talk back in March. I was supposed to talk before the pandemic got underway, but that put a damper on that. And I wasn't quite sure where this whole thing was gonna take me. But as I was putting the final touches on this talk today, I was thinking it's really about my mentor and friend, Meg Stewart, who was kind of a driving force for herpetology in Eastern New York and certainly in the Pine Barrens, and I owe her so much. And a final plug to my friend Matt Patterson for the tremendous illustrations he provided for this talk and for the artwork he did for my latest book. So, do we have time for some questions, Jackie?
Sure. If anybody has any questions, I'd like to put them in the Q&A.
Well,
Just look in, see if anybody has any.
I had a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep.
Al, the picture of the green snake and the eggs, I was surprised how large the eggs are compared to how small the snakes are. Maybe a naive question, but it struck
yes.
me.
A number of the small snakes have very large eggs, and they're always very elongate like that. So if you have a snake that has a whole bunch of eggs, they line up in the snake, as opposed to some of the others where you'd have them clumped around. But you wonder, I haven't done the measurements of how much the eggs weigh that any one female drops, but it must be a considerable part of her biomass. What's interesting is snakes have a lot of different ways to reproduce. Some of them give live birth, some of them lay kind of hard-shelled eggs, like the green snake egg is a rubbery shell. The ones that give live birth, it's almost like a placenta thing. But the green snake can hold her eggs after they've been fertilized, and she can hold them for extended periods of time. So when she finally lays them, they may hatch within just a couple of days, or they may hatch after a couple of weeks. For most of the snakes that lay eggs, it's an extended period of time, it's 3 or 4 weeks or more before the eggs would hatch.
I have a few questions here. One that I know I can answer if Al can.
All right.
First, we had a thank you. This was wonderful from Colleen. Another question was, are you still monitoring herps in the pine bush these days? I don't know if she was asking if you specifically are, but yes, we are. And then from Steve, do you think it's worth trying to reintroduce any of the extirpated species to the pine bush? If so, which do you think would have the highest likelihood of success?
This year, I haven't gotten over there at all, surprisingly. I would like to continue checking on the area where we had the green snakes. I would like to continue to check on the spotted turtle population, but I just have avoided doing much of that field work this year. As for reestablishing a species, we did a short-term experiment, 15 or 20 years ago with box turtles. And I think there is a possible way of doing that. I've talked to Neil about it, and he was enthusiastic, but it requires setting aside certain areas, and you want to do it in an area where you're not going to be coming in and doing heavy management for an extended period of time, like a significant number of years. So with those thoughts in mind, but I think in several of the sections of the pine bush, box turtles could possibly do it. Some that get established never move more than a couple hundred yards their entire life. I know a turtle was found on Long Island that was aged at 100 years old. It had been marked before it was 20, and it was found within less than 100 yards of where it was originally picked up.
Wow.
On the other hand, if you move a turtle and just turn it loose, they seem to have a tendency to try and find where they came from. So if you just plop a box turtle down that you don't know where it came from, it's going to beeline and be gone. And the ones that we released, several of them kept beelining north, and they'd eventually hit the thruway. And we had to keep bringing them back, put them back inside this little enclosure we had to hopefully deprogram for a little bit and turn them loose, but they were slow learners.
We have some more questions, but I did just want to tell you, we actually have photos from a eastern box turtle found on the Kings Road trails in there from one of my education interns a couple years ago.
Yes, one of our released ones, Kirsten found about 3 or 4 years after it was released.
Awesome.
But then we radio tracked it again, and we know it subsequently died. But yeah.
Yep. We have a couple of questions on the timber rattler. Are they still in the Lake George area? And in that same question, next question was, is the timber rattler snake, was that the nearest population of them?
Yeah, what did I just do? I don't know. Yeah, they're still in the Lake George area. That's probably not the closest one. They're down in Ulster County. They're out in Montgomery County, but they're very disjunct from the main core, which of course is the lower Hudson, Harriman State Park, that kind of area. But there is still a population up in the Lake George area.
Okay. Another question was for coverboard surveys. Did you and Kristen pioneer the sampling technique for herps, or had other herp specialists done this as well?
Oh no, a lot of people have been using cover boards for years. It's a standard technique. People are always trying to refine it. What makes better cover boards? I was just reading one where somebody was using like 3-foot squares of old carpeting as a cover board area.
Oh wow. What's the best way to survey eastern worm snakes? Same way using cover boards, or some other way?
Well, Lisa Pepino had found worm snakes under some of the cover boards that we had put out years ago. We never did under our cover boards. But since I have found them on Long Island and up here under junk, essentially, boards certainly would make a acceptable place. I found them under a 2x4 in the pine bush, even, you know, long skinny snake under a long skinny 2x4.
They also are asking, another one from Darwin, are any herp species in the pine bush fire dependent? No?
Well, I don't know if they're so much fire dependent. They're really more sand dependent. The soft soil is sandy soil. But if they're on the surface, when a fire goes through, they won't survive. I know a controlled burn down on Long Island that was done in May, which was the wrong time to do it there. They ended up killing 70 box turtles.
Ooh.
So yeah, you've got to be careful when you're doing those kind of things.
I have one more here. It's regarding the spadefoot. I know wood frogs are very pre-spring and early March explosive breeders, at least in the Saratoga battlefield. When does a spadefoot toad typically come out to call in the pine bush? And I know Dylan did not find any this year.
Oh, didn't she? No.
No.
Maybe that's why she didn't send me an email.
Yeah.
They're very storm dependent. If I've gone out after 2 inches of torrential rain and that's not enough to bring them out, you have to already have a fairly high water table from consistent rain events, and then you need a real torrential rain. Hurricane is a good sign.
Wow.
One of my friends who lives in Maryland says he gets them and he can hear them calling over the thunder from the major storms. I mean, the choruses are that loud.
Wow.
And another person told me they were out in the Albany Pine Bush one night during a rain event, and a jet plane flew over. And probably the roar of the plane made the spadefoot start calling. But again, it was on a really rainy night. All right.
It is about 8:10. Does anybody else have any other questions? We got a lot of thank yous and it was wonderful and great talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
I'll give it
Thank you,
another.
Al. That was great.
I'll see if I got any more here. Hold on, I got 2 more popped in. You've compiled a tremendous journey down memory lane for the 50-year period. Terrific job. Thank you.
Scott had a question if you want to grab that.
Okay, hold on.
Any luck with spadefoots after the tropical storm? We got, what, 3.5 inches or so?
I didn't get out.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Nope. I'm just quick. Oh, where will the link be available to this recording? I know others will regret missing it. We will have it on our website. Wendy usually takes a day or 2, but it will be on our website available. Maybe she can answer.
It's going to be on our YouTube channel.
Oh, YouTube. Okay, thanks, Wendy. And I think that is, no, wait, thank yous. I think that's it. Thank you so much.